You're not getting served in first class. People like you always try to sneak in where you don't belong." The words landed with enough force to silence the quiet hum inside the premium cabin. Conversations stopped halfway through unfinished sentences. Crystal glasses hovered in the hands of startled passengers. Even the soft background music seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the accusation. Flight attendant Nicole Bennett stood in the aisle with a polished smile that no longer looked professional. It looked victorious. Her posture was rigid, her chin slightly raised as she stared directly at the black woman seated in 2A, as though denying service was not merely procedure, but something she had rehearsed long before this morning. Naomi Carter never reached for her voice. She reached only for her composure. At 43 years old, she had learned that some people revealed themselves much faster than they revealed the truth. She wore dark jeans, a fitted charcoal sweater, white sneakers, and carried nothing more than a slim leather briefcase resting beneath the seat in front of her. No designer labels, no expensive jewelry, no entourage waiting outside the aircraft. Just another passenger, at least to everyone around her. Nicole folded her arms. "I'm speaking to you. First-class meals are reserved for verified premium guests." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. "My boarding pass was verified at the gate." Nicole gave a short laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Systems make mistakes. Staff don't." A businessman seated across the aisle lowered his newspaper. An elderly woman near the window frowned quietly without saying a word. 2 rows behind, someone discreetly unlocked a phone and angled it toward the unfolding confrontation. Nobody interrupted. "Not yet. Before we continue, have you ever seen someone judged before anyone knew the truth? Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories about courage and justice matter to you, we'd love to have you subscribe." Now, let's get back to Flight 218. Naomi glanced through the oval window where airport workers continued loading luggage beneath the wing. The aircraft remained connected to the jet bridge, waiting for departure. Inside, however, something far heavier than luggage had just been loaded into the cabin. Bias had boarded before many passengers even found their seats. Nicole leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite while making certain everyone nearby could still hear. "I'll ask one last time. Would you like to move before this becomes embarrassing?" Naomi looked back at her with remarkable calm. "It already became embarrassing. Just not for me." The answer was quiet, almost gentle, but it lingered through the cabin like a slow-moving current. Nicole's smile faded for the briefest moment before returning even tighter than before. She quietly withdrew the breakfast service prepared for seat 2A and turned away. "Then you won't be receiving service today." Nicole continued down the aisle, confirming breakfast selections for every other first-class passenger while deliberately passing seat 2A. By then, everyone had noticed the empty space where Naomi's service should have begun. A young flight attendant standing near the galley watched the exchange with growing uncertainty. Emily Brooks had only been flying for 6 months, but something about what she had witnessed refused to fit the company's training. She distinctly remembered scanning seat 2A before boarding. The boarding pass had flashed green. No warnings. No discrepancies. Nothing at all. She looked from Nicole to Naomi, then toward the digital manifest displayed on the service tablet in her hands. Her heartbeat quickened. Somewhere between the boarding gate and this silent cabin, the truth had started disappearing, and Emily was about to discover that refusing one passenger a meal would soon become the smallest mistake anyone on this flight would make. Emily Brooks remained frozen beside the service galley, her fingers resting lightly against the tablet that displayed the passenger manifest. She had replayed the boarding process in her head 3 times already, and every memory ended the same way. Seat 2A. Naomi Carter. Green verification. Priority boarding confirmed. No alerts. No restrictions. No discrepancies. Yet Nicole Bennett was behaving as though none of it had ever happened. Emily glanced toward Naomi again. The woman hadn't touched the armrest or shifted uncomfortably. She simply sat there with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived storms much louder than this one. Most passengers expected outrage when people were humiliated in public. Naomi offered none. That unsettled Emily far more than anger would have. Across the aisle, the businessman who had lowered his newspaper continued pretending to read, though his eyes hadn't moved across the page in several minutes. The elderly woman by the window looked from Nicole to Naomi with visible disappointment. gently placing her untouched glass of sparkling water back onto the tray table. Even the cabin's polished atmosphere had begun to crack beneath the invisible pressure building between rows 1 and 3. Nicole returned to the galley with practiced confidence. "Skip seat 2A," she told another attendant without lowering her voice. "We'll continue normal service." Emily hesitated. "Nicole, I thought her boarding pass scanned correctly." Nicole looked at her as if correcting reality itself had become an inconvenience. "You're new. Systems fail. Experience doesn't." Emily nodded automatically, but doubt settled deeper inside her stomach. Airlines trained crews to prioritize facts over assumptions. Everything on board revolved around documentation, verification, and procedure. Yet what she had witnessed wasn't procedure. It was judgment dressed in a uniform. Naomi calmly reached into the pocket of her charcoal sweater and removed a pair of reading glasses. Instead of arguing, she opened a slim notebook from her leather briefcase and quietly wrote a single sentence. Her handwriting remained steady despite every curious eye around her. The businessman finally leaned across the aisle. "Excuse me," he asked softly. "Aren't you going to say something?" Naomi closed the notebook before answering. "People usually tell me everything I need to know if I let them keep talking." The man leaned back without another word. Her answer lingered longer than any argument could have. Somewhere near the rear of first class, a teenage passenger removed his headphones. A young mother stopped entertaining her daughter with coloring books. More faces turned toward seat 2A than toward the safety demonstration playing silently on overhead screens. Nobody fully understood why this ordinary disagreement suddenly felt much larger than a delayed breakfast service. It felt like everyone had become unwilling witnesses to something that had happened before, somewhere else, to someone else. Naomi had seen those expressions many times throughout her life. At 24, wearing a navy blazer she could barely afford after graduating from business school, she had entered an executive airport lounge with a legitimate membership card. The receptionist had smiled politely before asking whether she was delivering food instead of traveling. The room had laughed. She remembered standing there with the same quiet expression she wore now, realizing that dignity was often questioned long before credentials ever were. That memory no longer carried pain. It carried perspective. She had promised herself that day never to confuse another person's prejudice with her own worth. The aircraft doors were still open. Passengers continued boarding through the jet bridge, and somewhere beyond the cabin windows the engines waited patiently for clearance. Inside, however, another departure was approaching. Emily looked once more at the digital manifest, then at Naomi's perfectly valid name glowing on the screen. For the first time since joining the airline, she wondered whether following orders and doing the right thing were about to become two very different choices. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding neared completion, but the tension inside first class only grew brighter. Nicole Bennett pushed the service cart forward with deliberate precision, stopping at every premium seat except 2A. One by one, passengers received warm towels, fresh coffee, chilled orange juice, and breakfast menus. When she reached Naomi Carter, Nicole rolled the cart straight past her without slowing down. The omission was impossible to miss. The businessman across the aisle frowned openly now. The elderly woman quietly folded her menu without placing an order. A silence heavier than conversation settled over the first rows. Naomi remained perfectly still. She watched the cart disappear toward the front galley before calmly returning her attention to the notebook resting on her lap. She wrote another sentence. Her breathing never changed. Nicole returned moments later carrying a single bottle of water. She stopped beside Naomi's seat, but made no effort to hand it over. "If you're staying," she said, "this is all you'll be getting until your status is verified." Naomi looked up slowly. "My status was verified before I stepped onto this aircraft." Nicole's smile tightened. "According to who?" "According to your own boarding system." Before Nicole could answer, another voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Daniel Foster stood in the aisle, his crisp uniform carrying the authority of thousands of flight hours. Nicole answered before Naomi had the opportunity. "Passenger refuses to cooperate with cabin procedures." Daniel looked directly at Naomi. "Ma'am, my crew informs me there's an issue regarding your eligibility for first-class service." Naomi met his eyes without hostility. "There is an issue. Your crew created it." Daniel remained expressionless. "Would you mind showing me your boarding pass?" Naomi removed it from the pocket of her notebook and handed it over without hesitation. Daniel studied it for several seconds. The barcode was intact. The name matched her government-issued identification visible inside the document holder. Seat 2A. First class. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet instead of returning it, he folded the boarding pass once and kept it in his hand. Nicole spoke quietly beside him. She could have manipulated the system. Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly. We'll have ground operations verify it before we close the aircraft door. Naomi extended her hand. I'd like my boarding pass back. Not until we're satisfied, Daniel replied. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again. It was no longer about breakfast service. It had become about possession, authority, and control. Behind seat 4A, a well-dressed white passenger wearing an expensive navy suit leaned into the aisle. His silver watch flashed beneath the cabin lights. Captain, he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. If there's uncertainty about her ticket, maybe she shouldn't be sitting here while paying customers wait. Nicole glanced toward him appreciatively. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Naomi turned toward the man. You've concluded quite a lot without asking a single question. He shrugged casually. Experience teaches you to recognize situations like this. Naomi's expression remained unreadable. Experience also teaches some people the wrong lessons. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody laughed. Nobody agreed aloud. Yet nobody interrupted either. Near the galley, Emily Brooks watched Daniel slide Naomi's boarding pass into his jacket pocket. Her pulse quickened. That violated procedure. Boarding documents were never retained without documented cause. She looked down again at her service tablet. Naomi Carter still appeared exactly where she belonged. Verified. Cleared. Premium cabin. Emily swallowed hard before taking one cautious step toward the captain. Sir. She began softly. Daniel turned. Yes. Emily hesitated just long enough to feel every eye in the galley settle on her. I believe the system already confirmed her seat before boarding. Nicole immediately cut across the sentence. Emily, finish preparing the cabin. The younger attendant nodded automatically, but doubt had already taken root. Across the aisle, another passenger quietly lifted a phone beneath a folded magazine and pressed record. Without anyone realizing it, the aircraft had stopped being just another flight to its destination. It had become a stage where every decision, every word, and every act of quiet prejudice was being witnessed by far more people than the crew believed. Emily Brooks kept her eyes on the electronic manifest long after Captain Daniel Foster walked away with Naomi Carter's boarding pass. Around her, the first-class cabin continued preparing for departure, yet nothing felt routine anymore. She refreshed the system once, then again, watching the same result appear every time. Seat 2A. Naomi Carter. First class. Verified. Priority boarding confirmed. No payment issues. No duplicate assignment. No security alerts. Every official record supported the woman quietly waiting by the window. Emily's heartbeat quickened. Training had always taught her that facts came first. Today, facts were being ignored. Across the aisle, Naomi rested her notebook on her lap without opening it again. She neither demanded the return of her boarding pass nor protested the growing attention surrounding her. Instead, she watched the activity outside the aircraft as baggage handlers finished loading the final containers beneath the wing. The contrast struck Emily. Everyone outside was preparing the aircraft for departure. Inside, someone seemed determined to prevent one passenger from taking the journey she had already paid for. Nicole Bennett approached the galley with confident strides. Cabin secure? She asked. Emily hesitated before answering. Nicole, the manifest still shows Ms. Carter is completely verified. I can't find anything that explains what's happening. Nicole barely glanced toward the tablet. You're looking at data. I'm looking at experience. But company policy tells us to verify through the system. Nicole folded her arms. Company policy also expects us to use judgment when something doesn't feel right. Emily waited for her to explain what exactly felt wrong. No explanation came. There was only certainty built on instinct rather than evidence. Nearby, the businessman who had questioned Nicole earlier quietly closed his newspaper altogether. The elderly woman by the window exchanged a concerned look with another passenger. Several travelers who had originally tried to ignore the confrontation were now openly watching every interaction between the crew and Seat 2A. Captain Foster returned from the jet bridge after briefly speaking with the gate supervisor. Emily gathered enough courage to step forward. "Captain," she said respectfully, "I've rechecked the passenger records several times. Ms. Carter's reservation is still fully verified. There aren't any operational flags in the system." Before Daniel could respond, Nicole answered for him. "Electronic systems don't always tell the whole story. If we discover a problem after departure, correcting it becomes much harder." Daniel remained silent. He glanced toward the open aircraft door where the final passengers were entering, then toward the clock mounted above the galley. Departure time was approaching, and every additional minute increased pressure on the crew. Emily recognized the conflict on his face. He wanted the flight moving, yet he still lacked a single document contradicting Naomi's reservation. Naomi finally looked toward the captain. Her voice remained steady enough that nearby passengers leaned in without realizing it. "Captain, may I ask one question?" Daniel nodded. "Go ahead. Has anyone found a single record showing I am not entitled to this seat?" The cabin fell silent. Daniel looked briefly toward Nicole. Nicole offered no documentation. Emily lowered her eyes to the glowing screen in her hands. The same green verification remained beside seat 2A, refusing to disappear no matter how many times she refreshed it. The businessman spoke quietly but clearly enough for several rows to hear. "Captain, if the records support her, what exactly are we waiting for?" No one answered. Even Nicole's confidence seemed less certain beneath the growing attention of the cabin. Daniel drew a slow breath, weighing procedure against mounting pressure. Then he looked directly at Naomi. His expression became firmer, his decision finally made. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "if this disagreement continues, I may have to ask you to leave the aircraft until the matter is reviewed." Captain Daniel Foster looked toward the open aircraft door, then back at Naomi Carter with the expression of a man who believed delay was the greatest inconvenience in the room. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "if this disagreement continues, I may have to ask you to leave the aircraft until the matter is reviewed." The words were delivered in a professional tone, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of an ultimatum. Every conversation in first class faded into silence. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. "You're asking a verified passenger to surrender her seat because your crew refuses to follow its own records." Daniel folded his arms. "I'm asking you to cooperate." Naomi nodded once, almost thoughtfully. "I've cooperated since the moment I boarded." Emily stood motionless near the galley. She knew exactly what the captain was proposing. Removing a passenger before departure was one of the most serious actions a crew could take. It required clear justification, documented evidence, and careful communication. None of those elements existed here. Yet events continued moving toward that outcome as though facts had quietly stepped aside. Nicole spoke before anyone else could. "Captain, the rest of our passengers shouldn't have to wait because one guest refuses reasonable instructions." That sentence finally changed something inside the cabin. The businessman across the aisle closed his laptop with a deliberate snap. "Reasonable?" he asked. "I've watched this from the beginning. I still haven't heard anyone explain what rule she actually violated." An elderly woman added calmly, "Neither have I." A younger passenger near the window lowered his phone only long enough to say, "Everything's being recorded." Nicole's confident expression flickered for the first time. She had expected passive observers. Instead, quiet witnesses were becoming active participants. Naomi remained seated. Her voice stayed measured. "Captain, before you make another decision, I'd like to ask a simple question." Daniel nodded cautiously. "Go ahead. Can anyone on this aircraft identify a single document showing I don't belong in this seat?" Nobody answered. Emily looked down instinctively at the manifest tablet still resting beside the service station. Green verification continued glowing beside seat 2A like a stubborn fact refusing to disappear. Naomi continued, "Then perhaps the problem isn't my ticket." The words hung in the air without accusation. They simply invited everyone present to examine what had actually happened instead of what they had assumed. For a brief moment, Naomi's thoughts drifted years into the past. She remembered standing outside the conference room of her first executive presentation after a receptionist politely redirected her toward the catering entrance. She had almost explained herself then. Instead, she had quietly walked to the correct meeting room, delivered the presentation, and won the contract. That experience had taught her a lesson she never forgot. When people build conclusions before gathering evidence, arguing rarely changes their minds. Reality eventually does. Back in the cabin, Daniel exhaled slowly. He could feel control slipping away, not because Naomi had raised her voice, but because the passengers had begun asking questions his crew could not answer. Emily finally took one careful step forward. "Captain," she said, her voice steadier than before. "The electronic manifest still confirms seat 2A. I believe we should verify the records before asking anyone to leave." Nicole immediately turned toward her. "Emily, that's enough." But this time, Emily didn't lower her eyes. The silence that followed felt different from every silence before it. It no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to expectation. Around the cabin, passengers waited to see what the crew would do next, and for the first time since boarding had begun, the authority in the room no longer rested entirely with the uniforms. The silence broke not with an argument, but with the unmistakable sound of a seatbelt unfastening. The businessman across the aisle rose to his feet and faced Captain Foster. "I'm not interested in delaying this flight," he said calmly, "but I'm even less interested in watching a passenger be removed without evidence." His voice carried through the premium cabin with quiet confidence. Before the captain could respond, the elderly woman in the front row stood beside him. "I've traveled long enough to know the difference between procedure and assumption," she said. "And today I've seen far too much of the second." One by one, more passengers released their seatbelts. A young couple stood together. A retired school principal near the window rose with surprising ease. The traveler who had been discreetly recording lowered his phone only long enough to say, "If she leaves, my video goes public before this plane reaches the runway." Emily watched the scene unfold in disbelief. Minutes earlier, every passenger had been an observer. Now they were becoming witnesses willing to attach their own names to what they believed was wrong. Captain Foster looked around the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to return to your seats." Nobody moved. The businessman folded his arms. "We'll sit when you explain why a verified passenger is being treated differently." Another voice joined in. "Show us the policy." Then another. "Show us the documentation. Show us the evidence." The requests remained respectful, yet they arrived from every direction. Nicole glanced from face to face, realizing that the confidence she had carried since boarding was disappearing under the weight of a single question nobody aboard could answer. Naomi Carter remained seated throughout it all. She neither encouraged the passengers nor attempted to stop them. She simply watched as ordinary people made an extraordinary decision. Years earlier, Naomi had learned that lasting change rarely began with the loudest person in the room. It began when quiet people decided they could no longer justify remaining silent. Emily stepped beside the captain, holding the electronic manifest where he could clearly see it. "Sir," she said steadily, "every system available to the cabin crew confirms seat 2A. I believe continuing this confrontation places the airline at greater risk than resolving it correctly." Daniel studied the glowing screen. The green verification remained impossible to ignore. Around him, dozens of eyes waited for his next decision. The atmosphere inside first class had transformed completely. This was no longer a disagreement between a crew member and a passenger. It had become a question of accountability witnessed by an entire cabin. A flight attendant from the main cabin quietly approached the galley after hearing the raised voices. She looked toward Emily, then at the manifest, then at Naomi, sensing immediately that something significant had unfolded before she arrived. Nicole attempted to regain control. "Everyone, please return to your seats. We have a schedule to maintain." The businessman answered gently, "Respect should stay on schedule too." A few passengers nodded. Others offered quiet applause that spread through the cabin in restrained waves. No one shouted. No one argued. Yet the collective message became impossible to misunderstand. Captain Foster drew a slow breath. For the first time since stepping into the aisle, he recognized that authority alone would not resolve what had happened. Every decision from this point forward would be remembered not only by the crew, but by every passenger standing before him. Naomi finally looked out the window toward the terminal, where ground crews continued their routines completely unaware of the turning point inside the aircraft. She knew the hardest battles were rarely won through confrontation. Sometimes they were won the moment ordinary people decided that fairness belonged to everyone, not just the person sitting in the most important seat. Captain Daniel Foster looked around the cabin one final time before slowly removing Naomi Carter's boarding pass from his jacket pocket. The confidence that had defined his voice only minutes earlier had begun to erode beneath the steady pressure of unanswered questions. Without speaking, he handed the document back. Naomi accepted it with the same calm expression she had worn since boarding, carefully sliding it into her notebook before closing the cover. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply thanked him with a quiet nod. That unexpected restraint unsettled the cabin even more than confrontation would have. Emily remained beside the service station, watching every movement. She sensed the situation had reached a point where another accusation would only deepen the damage already done. Naomi glanced briefly at the screen of her phone. Until that moment, she had made no calls, sent no messages, and asked no one to intervene. Now, with deliberate calm, she unlocked the device and selected a single contact saved near the top of her list. The call connected almost immediately. "Good morning," Naomi said in an even tone. "I'm aboard Flight 218, still at the gate. I'd appreciate it if someone from Executive Operations could review an incident before departure." She paused for a moment, listening. "No, there is no emergency. Just bring the facts." Then she ended the call. The entire conversation had lasted less than 30 seconds. No raised voice. No dramatic announcement. No mention of titles or authority. Just quiet confidence that suggested she expected to be heard. Nicole folded her arms. "Calling someone won't change airline policy." Naomi met her gaze. "I'm not asking anyone to change policy." Her reply was almost gentle. "I'm asking them to confirm it." Those words settled over the cabin with remarkable weight. Several passengers exchanged thoughtful glances. The businessman who had first stood in Naomi's defense leaned back into his seat, but remained attentive. The elderly woman smiled faintly, as though she finally understood why Naomi had refused to argue from the beginning. She had never been trying to win an argument. She had been allowing the truth enough time to arrive on its own. A few moments later, Captain Foster's company phone vibrated sharply. He looked at the screen, hesitated, and answered. "Captain Foster speaking." His posture changed almost immediately. Yes, we're still at the gate. I understand." He listened without interrupting, his expression becoming noticeably more restrained with each passing second. When the call ended, another notification appeared on Nicole's service tablet. She opened it, expecting an ordinary operational update. Instead, her face slowly lost its color. The message instructed the cabin crew to suspend any further action involving Seat 2A until Executive Operations completed an immediate review. Emily noticed Nicole reading the message twice before lowering the tablet without a word. Around the cabin, passengers sensed the shift before anyone explained it. Whatever certainty had existed among the crew only minutes earlier had disappeared. Captain Foster looked toward Naomi again, this time without the assumption that had shaped every previous exchange. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "Executive Operations has requested that we pause boarding procedures for a brief review." Naomi inclined her head. Of course. There was no satisfaction in her voice, only quiet composure. Outside the aircraft windows, ground vehicles continued crossing the tarmac beneath the morning sun. Inside the cabin, however, something much larger than a flight schedule had begun to move. The passengers no longer waited to see whether Naomi would prove who she was. They waited to discover why someone in Executive Operations had responded to one calm phone call with immediate urgency. And for the first time since the aircraft door had opened, the people who had been asking questions were no longer the passengers. They were the crew. 7 minutes after Naomi Carter ended the brief phone call, the aircraft door opened once again. Boarding had already finished, yet no one stepped forward to remove the jet bridge. Instead, 3 senior airline executives entered the first-class cabin alongside the regional director of customer experience. Their pace was calm but purposeful, and every crew member immediately recognized them. Conversations faded into silence. Captain Daniel Foster straightened instinctively. Nicole Bennett forced a professional smile that disappeared the moment the senior executive walked past both of them without stopping. He approached Naomi first. "Ms. Carter," he said respectfully, extending his hand. "Thank you for waiting. We apologize for the delay." Naomi rose calmly and returned the handshake. "Thank you for coming. I only asked that the facts be reviewed. They already have been." the executive replied. He turned toward Captain Foster, speaking clearly enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Our operations center has completed an immediate review of the boarding logs, gate scans, reservation records, and cabin reports. Ms. Carter's first-class reservation has been valid from the moment she checked in this morning. There has never been a verification issue involving seat 2A. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Emily Brooks felt her shoulders relax for the first time since boarding. The businessman across the aisle slowly lowered his phone. The elderly woman closed her eyes briefly, as though relieved that the truth had finally spoken for itself. The executive continued. Our review also confirms there was no operational reason to withhold service, retain a boarding pass, or request that Ms. Carter surrender her seat. Captain Foster lowered his gaze. Nicole's expression slowly drained of color. She opened her mouth as if searching for an explanation, but none came. The regional director stepped forward. Captain Foster, Ms. Bennett, another crew will complete this flight's premium cabin service. Both of you will meet with corporate standards immediately after landing while this incident is formally investigated. Nicole stared in disbelief. There has to be some misunderstanding. The senior executive looked at her steadily. There was. It happened before we arrived. He paused for a moment before addressing the entire first-class cabin. Many of you have been wondering why executive operations responded so quickly. The answer is simple. Ms. Carter is not only a valued passenger. She is the chief executive officer of Carter Aviation Holdings, the investment group that became this airline's controlling shareholder earlier this year. Today's journey was intended to be a private trip. Her position should never have mattered. But since assumptions replaced procedure, you deserve to understand why executive operations treated this matter with such urgency. Audible gasps spread through the cabin. Several passengers looked back toward Naomi with open astonishment. The businessman slowly shook his head, not because she was a CEO, but because he realized how easily everyone could have accepted the crew's assumptions had no one spoken up. Nicole stood completely motionless, finally understanding who she had publicly humiliated. Naomi noticed the shock surrounding her and gently addressed the passengers before anyone else could speak. Please don't let my title become today's lesson, she said quietly. If fairness depends on discovering that someone is a CEO, then we've learned nothing. Every passenger deserves the same dignity I deserved before any of you knew my name. The words settled over the cabin more powerfully than the reveal itself. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. The replacement flight attendant approached Naomi with a warm smile and placed a freshly prepared breakfast on her tray table. Ms. Carter, she said sincerely, on behalf of everyone who believes service begins with respect, I'm truly sorry. Naomi returned the smile with quiet grace. Thank you. I accept the apology. Now let's make sure the next passenger never has to earn the respect that should have been given from the beginning. Soft applause began near the front row before spreading naturally throughout the first-class cabin. This time it was not applause for a powerful executive. It was applause for a woman who had quietly reminded an entire aircraft that dignity should never depend on titles, appearance, or assumptions. 28 minutes after the scheduled departure time, Flight 218 finally pushed back from the gate. The captain informed passengers that an operational review had delayed the flight, but everyone seated in first class knew the real reason. It had never been about a reservation. It had been about assumptions replacing evidence. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt entirely different from the silence that had greeted boarding. Breakfast was finally served. Conversations resumed quietly. Yet every passenger carried away something far more lasting than a delayed meal. Emily Brooks approached Naomi Carter after the seatbelt sign was switched off. This time she wore no uncertainty, only quiet gratitude. Ms. Carter, she said softly, thank you for speaking with dignity when you had every reason to be angry. Naomi smiled gently. Anger can expose a problem. Character is what helps solve it. Emily nodded, knowing those words would remain with her throughout her career. Across the aisle, the businessman extended his hand. I don't know if I would have spoken up if she hadn't spoken first, he admitted, glancing toward the elderly woman who had also stood in Naomi's defense. The woman smiled warmly. Sometimes courage simply needs someone willing to take the first step. Naomi shook both of their hands. Today wasn't about defending me alone, she said. It was about protecting the standard every passenger deserves. Before returning to the flight deck, Captain Daniel Foster stopped beside Naomi's seat once more. His expression was sincere, stripped of the confidence that had earlier overshadowed his judgment. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology. I failed to follow the very procedures I was trusted to uphold." Naomi met his eyes calmly. "Then honor the apology by making sure it never happens again." Daniel gave a respectful nod. "I will." After landing later that afternoon, the airline announced that Captain Foster and Nicole Bennett had been removed from active duty pending the outcome of an independent investigation. Their responsibilities would remain suspended while corporate standards reviewed every decision made before departure, including passenger statements, electronic records, and cabin video. The company also confirmed that every member of the cabin crew across the network would complete updated training focused on evidence-based decision-making, unconscious bias, and the obligation to protect every passenger's dignity equally. Naomi requested no special disciplinary action beyond a fair investigation. Accountability should correct people, she told the executives privately, not simply embarrass them. Several weeks later, the airline introduced a revised boarding protocol requiring any challenge to a passenger's verified reservation to be supported by documented evidence before service could be denied or removal considered. Emily attended the first training session and recognized many of Naomi's own words woven into the new material. Looking back on Flight 218, many employees later described that morning as the moment the airline began rebuilding trust through accountability rather than assumption. The conflict had begun because one woman had been judged before the facts were checked. It ended because ordinary passengers refused to ignore what they knew was wrong. One young flight attendant chose evidence over silence, and responsible leaders accepted that trust is restored only through accountability. Naomi looked out the window one last time before closing her notebook. On its final page, she wrote a single sentence. "True leadership is measured not by power, but by how faithfully we protect the dignity of those whose voices are too often ignored." She closed the notebook, enjoyed the breakfast that had arrived much later than it should have, and continued her journey. Long after Flight 218 reached its destination, most passengers forgot the delay. But few forgot the morning an entire cabin chose fairness over assumption, courage over convenience, and truth over prejudice, before they ever learned that the quiet woman in seat 2A happened to be the CEO.